which segues us very nicely onto our next question, which is discussing exactly that. So you've recently released your Progressive Overload course. Is it released yet, or is it not quite there?
It's not released to the public right now. We've released it only to current students because I think I'm about 2/3 of the way through it right now. Because one of the things I always like to do is I like to release a course either in part and actually get feedback and questions so that I can address and fill in any gaps or whatnot, right? So we should, by the time people get this, we should be pretty close to releasing that to the public. But
and using your community to beta test it, so to speak, and then refine that a bit more, right?
Yeah, because that's a big thing that I always try and focus on is it's not about the information I deliver, it's about the outcome of the person taking the course, right? Because it doesn't matter if it makes sense to me, right? Like, I'm not trying to tell people how much I know, right? I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do I deliver this information in a way so that when somebody leaves, that it's effective, it's beneficial, it's valuable for them, they can apply it. And so we're constantly redoing content and updating to content, which is something you really don't see in the industry at all. Pretty much, one thing, you guys, here's just a random tangent. Like, if you want to know a company that really cares about what you get, look and see if they go back and they audit and get rid of old bad information, like if they change their viewpoint on something, versus somebody that's like, oh yeah, that was a YouTube video, it got a lot of likes or whatever, so I'm just going to leave it there even though now my viewpoint on it is different, or I know it's wrong, like I'm just going to leave it there forever. Like, we constantly, every time we change our point of view on something, we go and we cut out that old stuff. So we're always representing what's most accurate, even if it doesn't necessarily work out well for our, our engagement or whatever. Like, oh, that was a great video, people loved it. Yeah, but it wasn't quite correct. Kill it anyway.
It's more authentic as well, right? Because it becomes a discussion point for your coaches, and when you can actually, it's content for social media. Listen, we actually believe this, but guess what? We've been willing to say, we've been presented with better either evidence or anecdotes or experience to say this probably isn't a good way to approach things anymore. So we're going to let you guys know we're not doing things like that anymore. I think that just holds you at such a higher level of credibility. But like you said, unfortunately, in an industry which a lot of people don't want to let that stuff go because it hurts the ego to say, what, I was wrong, or I don't do it like that anymore. And I've had a few of those in the last 2 years, and it's not nice. You look back and think, man, why did I do it like that? I just didn't understand it well enough. And it's tough to say that. I just didn't understand well enough, but I'm glad that I do now. And I think that's great.
And it's work to remake the content. You have to, in some cases, you have to take a blow, especially on like YouTube. If you have a video that like is doing well for certain search terms, that's getting people to your brand, it's hard to say, man, a lot of this particular video is getting me a lot of eyes. Do I want to get rid of that? Like from a business perspective. And that's where you have to have a strong moral ethics to your brand and your business to be able to say, yeah, absolutely. Right. Like, okay, I was able to do it well once. I just got to figure out how to do it again, but with more updated information.
I think it's great that you guys do that. So talking about progressive overload, I know that you, and it's funny because it's actually exactly what you just said was one of the reasons why I wanted to ask this question, because I noticed on your social media that you actually posted out to your audience, how do you define progressive overload? Give me your definition. You asked, everyone just like chip in, tell me how would you define it? And I saw a lot of guys who are also well known in the industry, like Luke Tallock and a bunch of other guys come on there and give their versions of it. So I'm going to flip that on you a little bit. How would you personally define progressive overload? And what are the kind of key variables that coaches should be keeping in mind when they're trying, and within their coaching delivery and their programming when it comes to progressive overload?
Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna define progressive overload in a way that we'll say makes it a functional term or makes it applicable to the way that we use it. And so by that, I mean that for us, progressive overload means that we are in some way, shape, or form manipulating the training so that we continue to get a stimulus despite the accumulation of adaptations that would have then made, the same stress become more homeostatic, right? So progressive overload is a way of continuing to hit that threshold of stimulus needed for further adaptation, right? And then of course I talked a little bit on the live about how some people look at it on the on the other end, on the outcome end, that if you are able to do more, then that is a sign that you did get positive adaptations, right? And I think that's one of those things where it's like, okay, those are both two ways. It's almost kind of like checks and balances of knowing whether you are actually progressing appropriately. Were you able to achieve, whatever performance metric or whatever improvement thing that you were looking for? Were we able to see signs that adaptation did occur? So I look at that as like, that's a sign that we are achieving what we're trying to do with the stimulus, which means we're probably progressing, in the appropriate direction or the appropriate amount. And with that, my definition means it's not restricted to just load or just reps or just any of the things. Like there's so many things that you could do. When we're looking at it in terms of stimulus, then it really, all I care about is that whatever we did increase the stimulus, right? And because that's the outcome. So some people are like, oh, progressive overload, like sets don't count, or rest intervals don't count, or it's only this, or it's only that. And I'm like, why? So what is it then? Like, when you add that, what do you add? Because if we look at it from the scope of stimulus, then it's like, well, I add the appropriate thing to progress in the direction I want to get the stimulus that I want. And to me, that's the only functional way of looking at it and using it. I think, in social media, it's very easy to get a lot of engagement when you have a strong opinion on something that is a little bit of a dichotomy, or dogmatic, but being very like, oh, it depends. Like that's the most unpopular answer, like on social media. If you want to get the fewest amount of likes and comments, then come out with a nuanced "it depends" discussion on something. If a lot of likes or comments, you'd be like, if you think sets are progressive overload, then you're a dumbass. Like I guarantee if you do that, you will get infinitely more. And the same thing, you say the opposite thing and you will also get more engagement, when in reality the truth is somewhere in between. And so when I look at these tools or these definitions that we use, I look at like, okay, does the definition actually serve its function? And if it doesn't, likely if you look back in the research and the history of where did this thing come from, what you probably see is that there's been dogmatic viewpoints that have ultimately resulted in this very restrictive, reduced definition of this thing, right? When in reality, if you take like progressive overload, you look at the history, like, well, it came largely from strength training, okay? But their goal, their stimulus in that case was very load based, right? And so it's easy to like make the false conclusion that like, well, okay, progressive overload means you have to add load, but that just happened to be the thing that was the most important for the stimulus of improving strength, is that, well, our goal is to be able to put more load on the bar. But if we're going to apply this principle to somebody that's trying to lose body fat or trying just to build muscle or trying to improve in any performance or health marker, there's more stimulus than just more load, right? So the term needs to be functional to the way that you're using it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you probably see, and you've probably noticed this yourself in the industry, there's kind of like, I guess, almost two camps when it comes to how to best go about training. So you've kind of got the, for lack of a better term, the lower volume, higher intensity camp. And then you've kind of got the, and that's the likes of your Dr. Scott Stevensons, Don Trudells. These are the guys that kind of popularized a lot of that style of training. And then you've got obviously your kind of Mike Israetels and this sort of side of things, which is very much about volume is kind of more so the key driver, and it's all about progressing that over time. So where do you think the danger comes from being so maybe pigeonholed into one or other of those approaches?
Well, again, it goes back to N of one, right? So, one man's high volume is another man's low volume, right? One person's tolerance to intensity is very different. And that's not just from person to person. That changes within that person over time, right? Like as you accumulate training age, as you accumulate adaptations, as your execution gets better, your neurological efficiency, you just simply are able to get more out of a rep and you're able to get more out of a set, right? So now, like, 2 years into your career, when you take an exercise to failure, it's probably a very different point than when you first started training. And so there's so much context that says, well, where you need to exist on this continuum of intensity and volume is going to be something that's always going to change. And the reality is, why not use both tools to the point where it's efficient and optimal for that individual at that point in time. Okay. But that's not a system, like systems sell, right? Like, okay, this is the low volume system. This is the HIT, high intensity training system or whatever. And there's a place for that, right? And, there's nothing wrong with experimenting with these things and seeing how they work for you if that's the level that you're at. But anytime you go and you get a pre-made program, preset thing, you just have to accept the fact that, this may not be optimal for me. Will I maybe make progress doing it? Sure. Maybe will I make more progress in this other thing? Yeah. Or maybe less or not. And could you get valuable information? Yeah. Because not everybody is going to take the leap of like, okay, I need to figure out exactly what's the best for me, because there's a lot of education and knowledge and just simple, like, like tracking of things and being self-aware or having a coach, et cetera, that goes into finding what's optimal for me right now. And all, like, because there's layers and layers and layers of nuance and context that need to go into that. So there will always be a place for some of these, more dogmatic approaches or whatever, of like for people to experiment in their younger years, because there's such a leap from I have no idea what I'm doing to now I know I'm doing like the absolute best thing for me. Right. And you can't just make that overnight. You got to do something. Like I got to go to the gym today and do something. Right. And so if I don't know what's perfect yet, what I'm going to do is I'm going to experiment with some of these other things, and maybe I'm going to gravitate more in one direction or another. But more often than not, most people are not going to live on the extremes, right? Most people are going to be somewhere in the middle. So that's probably one thing that you should take from that, right? Which is why, when we put programs on our site, we have like a selection of different stimulus and stuff, and we're working on basically trying to help people with like an assessment protocol, figuring out, okay, what would be an ideal stimulus to impose on your body right now, and how could we kind of use technology to kind of get an assessment of like, all right, this type of training, but either more intense or high volume or somewhere in between of that same type of stimulus, what would be an ideal approach. And I think that's the direction that we're going to get, especially as some of our devices improve and we're able to collect, better data and stuff like that. I hear even maybe the new Apple Watch might have an O2 sensor, right? So like when you're doing like, metabolic training, maybe we can see like how low do you get your oxygen saturation in the middle of a HIIT workout or something like so. Technology is not where it needs to be for us to utilize it really well yet. But I think, in another 2 years, we're going to have like some really cool tools to be able to direct beginners, to like help them kind of leapfrog some of this experimental time in there. I don't even know if I answered your question now that I've been rambling.
No, you didn't. It actually led me on to just something that reminded me from a conversation. But you kind of, I suppose, talked about that in a bit more of almost a bit of a macro level, which is kind of, like you said, almost kind of all you can really do sometimes when you don't have the context to go with it. Maybe a specific example that I had from a chat with my coach the other day when I was going through a case study with him of a client, and different ways that we could look to potentially progress what they're doing over the course of their mesocycle. And we had this discussion around like, well, what methods potentially for the stimulus we're trying to achieve. In this case, it was someone doing a bit more of a lower volume, but a bit more like going to failure on those particular working sets, trying to just get that minimum effective dose, teach them to work a bit harder. And we discussed like what might be a way without necessarily, in order to increase tonnage over time, how can we go about doing that? And then it came to a discussion around, well, what about say a rest pause versus a drop set, and diving into that. And it's funny what you talked about, like you have to bear in mind like what is the stimulus we're trying to achieve. And so we looked at, okay, if we maybe do something like a rest pause, that might stay more in line with the goal of keeping the highest amount of mechanical tension on those exercises for that particular, what we're trying to get out of that. Whereas if we implement a drop set, that starts to very quickly potentially switch over to much more metabolic demands. And so again, without knowing the nuances of that, a lot of people like see these popularized programs like Buy My Bikini 3.0 and do a double drop set on the last set, and it's like, well, you just went from doing something that was really heavy loaded, and the program says, well, this is about getting strong, but then there's all this metabolite work in there, and I think I see a lot of that out there as well. I think your course is probably, from what I understand from just seeing some of the snippets, hopefully people are going to start to be able to think a little bit more granular than just this is a method. And I think what people get stuck in with potentially the volume, thinking that more volume is better, is that, right, well, if I just do drop sets, that's still more volume. But it's a completely different stimulus to implementing something like a rest pause, or just adding an additional top set to that particular exercise, for example. Is that kind of more what you're trying to get at with this people's way of thinking, in terms of not just looking so method, and being a bit more like, what's the why? What are you actually trying to get out of this?
Yeah, because that's the goal is that how do I, if I know the stimulus, what is the most optimal way to add more of that,
Yeah.
right? Because anytime we add more, it comes with a variety of things in terms of neurological stress, mechanical stress, metabolic stress. Like everything that we do has a certain amount of that. Like it's like there's no way that we ever do a rep that has at least some component of all three of those things. And the thing is that like, if you were to just line up all of the programs in the world and just throw them on a table in front of me, I would be able to pick up probably, 75, 80% of them. And I wouldn't be able to say, is this a good or a bad program without knowing who it's for and what their goal is or whatever, like without that individual's context. It could be bad or good. Now there's some where you just look at it and I'm just like, yeah, there's nothing that makes sense about some of these things, right? For example, like one of those would be I saw a program that came through my email the other day from a company that won't be named, and like it had all these exercises. Like one of the exercises like later in there like had this like exorbitant tempo or whatever, but it ended up being like a 3.5-minute set or something like that, like a 3.5-minute set of like glute bridges or something like that. And I'm like, okay, if we can do it for 3.5 minutes, we're probably not doing anything productive. And this was supposed to be a hypertrophy program. Like at that point in time, like I don't care how the set is organized or whatever. Like at 3.5 minutes, like what the heck are we doing? And it just doesn't make sense for any other physiological stimulus that we would be correlating to, right? But what's better, a drop set or a rest pause set or whatever, or maybe in some of those contexts where it's like, okay, we had the strength work and then we throw a metabolic thing at the end. There are times where that may be beneficial, for some people, and there's other times where that may actually take away, right? So you have to have those contexts. And that's, again, like I said, with the, any sort of pre-made program, you just have to consider that, like, look, somebody wrote this to try and be good for the majority of people that are going to take it. Whether or not they succeeded or not, we can't say. But you just have to accept that's the context of how this program is written, or any sort of advice, right? Like any advice that we talk about here, like how to program or whatever, is limited. Like I have to word that in a way of like, okay, how can I say something that will benefit most people and have the least negatives, to anybody that would try it, until we have that individual context, right? And that's why learning the principles is such more valuable than learning a system of like, okay, cool, like now I know how to do this type of training. And I'm like, okay, probably would be better to know what it takes to get that type of stimulus in an individual. Would be that's much more of the teach a man a fish to approach to it, right? So you can look at something like you mentioned, tonnage, so like tonnage is one way of looking at volume, right? But tonnage doesn't account for, like, tonnage accounts more for tendon to tendon mechanical tension. So that means like basically how much work the muscle did as a whole, but it doesn't count very much on what we would say the stimulus for hypertrophy, which would be more of a mechanical tension at a fiber level, which has to do much more with how much of that work was done at a certain level of fatigue, right? Into like when we're looking at effective reps, or done in a certain, velocity, et cetera, right? So this is what I'm trying to do with the progressive overload, is trying to help people look at some of these metrics to decide, or to help them figure out if they're being efficient with those, right? Because like, for instance, like one of the examples that I've went through is like, there's cases where you could drop reps and increase load, but tonnage goes down. But if we were to actually like look at the principle, it's like, but effective reps actually went up. Like this was an increase in stimulus, even though tonnage went down. And so it's taking the pros and cons of all of these things, right? Because you could say, well, how do I calculate volume? Is it by hard sets? Is it by tonnage? Am I trying to estimate effective reps? Is it X amount of sets at an average RPE. Like, what are all the, like, what am I actually qualifying of volume, right? And how well does that relate to my stimulus? Like, if your goal is like, how much energy did I expend? Tonnage is a really good estimator of that, right? As long as you standardize it by exercise, right? Meaning you can't compare a leg press to a lateral raise on energy expenditure, and you can't compare a leg press to a squat. So on a leg press, you're actually only lifting like half that weight, right? Or less. So tonnage, like the way that we kind of go through some solutions on how to compare tonnage across different exercises, right? So that we can kind of like equal them out. So we go through a little bit of math in there, but it's just understanding like, okay, if I want to know like how much energy I'm expending, then maybe that's going to be a valuable thing to track. And if I'm focusing on hypertrophy, maybe I want to focus on how do I get more effective reps without like increasing that a ton, because what's going to happen is my progressions are going to run me into a wall sooner if I'm adding a lot of work compared to the actual amount of stimulus. But if I'm focusing on a transformation client, like that's trying to burn body fat, and I'm working more on energy expenditure and nutrient partitioning, I may actually want to bias more in the direction of I'm actually accomplishing more workload, right? Because that's now the goal of the session, right? So there's lots of different things that you can do, and that's where being able to kind of know what a tool is good for, or what a measurement is good for, and what its limitations are, can help you understand like, well, all right, this was a very important metric for this last program. In this new program, it means, doesn't mean anything, right? Or maybe it's actually counter of what I'm going for, right? It's maybe I'm trying to limit this, right? And so that's kind of what I'm trying to do with that progressive overload course, to help people have more of that context and understand the principles of like, well, depending on what you're doing, you may want this thing to go up, down, you may want it to go fast, and also understanding how changing the different variables in training affect those things. All right. So for instance, like tonnage, most people calculate it as just, sets, reps, load. Okay. But they're not accounting for one, the exercise, and two, they're not accounting for distance over time. Right. Which like when we weight lift, like what is weight, right? Like, so we pick up a dumbbell and whatever the number on it is, right? Reality, that number is its mass, as far as are concerned. What makes it weight is gravity, which is a time and distance equation. So this is where people are like, oh, tempo doesn't matter. And I'm like, well, if we're actually measuring the amount of work that we do, how far we move a weight and how long we're moving it are just as important as the amount of mass that we're working, right? And anybody that doesn't believe it, just make them do pause squats, right? Like that's the great equalizer. You win that argument every time. Like, well, I mean, you either did less reps or less load, or what you can't like, but it's still like, are you going to argue and tell me that wasn't more or equal to the amount of work that you were doing? And so being able to figure out, well, okay, maybe like a perfect example of this is like, so maybe you have somebody and one of the limiting factors is like, man, I just don't want to put any more load on this person's back. Like we're getting to that point now where that stability or control is starting to becoming a limiting factor, right? But instead of adding load, I could add a 1 second pause at the bottom, right? Where the legs are under a lot more load, but the spine isn't under any more load, or it's not as much of an increase, depending on how you set it up. And all of a sudden, I've achieved an increase in tonnage, right? If we factor in distance and time for the muscles that I was targeting, and I've decreased the tonnage on the spine, right? So maybe that would be a more efficient way of going about that goal. If all of a sudden I'm starting to reach that point where it's like, all right, now just managing the spinal load, right, is an issue, right? Or you have a person that's progressing to the point where it's like, yeah, we used to be able to squat on Monday and deadlift on Thursday, no problem. But now that they're stronger, they can't do that, right? Like, they can't load the spine with that much frequency because they're just working at higher intensities. They're stronger now, right? But when they were doing like 95 pounds, on the squat and 135 on the deadlift, yeah, cool. Like we could have done those every other day, possibly for that person, but now that they're doing like, double their body weight on both of these exercises, we have to find better solutions, whether that's pauses or switching up squat for hack squat or swapping out deadlift for leg press or whatever it may be. It's like, okay, cool. How can I use all of the tools that I have available, either whether it's exercise selection, training variables, to most efficiently make the progression that I want and limit progressing in things that are just going to take away from my recovery or are going to complicate my programming because I can't maintain the volume or frequency that I want. They become obstacles for me to being able to progress.
Yeah, I think that speaks to your concept that you often talk about of time under significant tension, and that's not often looked at when it comes to tempo as well. Tempo's kind of like, but I was doing 6 seconds of work. Is like, well, 4 seconds of that work might even be done at a part of the range when there's actually not much tension going on. So how effective is that versus, like you said, the pause or like you see a lot of, and again, this comes from the I suppose the sensation-based camp where people are doing lateral raises and they're going super slow through the concentric, which from a profile point of view doesn't really make that much sense given that you're already going to be so weak by the time you move into that position. So, okay, you might have added more time under tension. So it kind of works on the flip side. You might have added more time under tension, but it's not significant tension because actually probably more beneficial to increase the load and actually have a bit more momentum going into that top position, right? So it's interesting, like you say, it depends on the exercise and is the tension actually contributing some form of significant tension or stimulus to what you're trying to do. And I think
usually when you've
seen using the TUST, I don't think anyone, I've not seen anyone else use that, at least maybe that's a common term you did or someone else did, I don't know.
Now, Chris Beardsley did an article a long time ago, and he used time under super high tension. So it was like TUSHT, TUSHT. And he was referring more towards, in that article, more towards the effective reps model, meaning that basically the time that you spent in the last few reps was more significant than the time that you spent in the earlier reps, which is a factor, right? But for our definition, we're taking a little bit more broad of it's not just fatigue, but it's also the resistance profile, et cetera. So it's like all of the things that are affecting the amount of mechanical tension, both from a tendon to tendon and a fiber level, whereas his was specifically referencing the effective reps model of like, okay, the time under tension doesn't matter until you're getting into those points, meaning that like you need to extend the time into the fatigue reps so that of the total time that you did, more of it was significant because you spent more of it closer to fatigue, right? Which is an important aspect too, but he didn't come into talking about also that like, well, there's a different portion of a lift that may be higher tension than another portion of a lift, right? Et cetera. And I think you have to have those two things kind of, they overlap on each other, right? So like if you're spending time where the exercise is hardest while under fatigue, you're going to have the most significant tension that way, which is the opposite of what most people do. As they get tired, they try and spend or avoid the hardest or most challenging portions of an exercise, right? And to comment on the slow tempo thing, because that is probably a key indicator that somebody's basing a lot of their stuff on the sensation is when you're purposely going slow, because the thing that should make us go slow is either fatigue or the amount of resistance. Those are the things that should slow down a movement. Now that doesn't mean that like you need to be trying to fling weights as fast as possible. Like if you're doing a lateral raises and you're doing a set of 10, you shouldn't like be clanging the dumbbells above your head on the first rep because it's a rep that you could do 9 more times. But you shouldn't be going intentionally slow. Going intentionally slow usually means you are co-contracting, which means that you're contracting muscles at the same time that oppose that movement. And that's kind of how you're coordinating that slow movement. And what happens with that is that we're teaching the body to create more stress around the joint than is needed to act on that load. And we're teaching it to recruit things that aren't necessarily going to be efficient in terms of the joint mechanics. And so we see people develop some pretty crappy motor patterns. And I would say we have a pretty good correlation between injury for people that do some of these sensation techniques, because essentially you're practicing doing the exercise inefficiently from an internal mechanics perspective. So you're creating a poor motor pattern. So then when you do fatigue or you do use a heavier load or you do get a little off form, you're in a less ideal situation to be able to compensate for those changes, and you're more likely to get injured, right? And it also just, you can't produce that much significant tension with a co-contraction. because you're internally regulating that to be efficient. So what's going to happen is, as one side fatigues, the other side just takes off load, right? So it's automatically like you're internally deloading to make sure you never get significant tension, essentially, with those things. So the only thing that you ever usually accumulate is metabolic fatigue. Like you get tired. That's about the extent of when you do those things, right? As you build up some metabolic fatigue, you get tired.
Locking down the scaps to do the lateral raises as well, and it's just one thing pushing against the other. It's kind of like what actually ends up being achieved in that situation, other than like what I've had recently, which is taking on a client from someone who teaches a lot of those type of methods, and then her scaps and everything were completely messed up. Luckily, it didn't take longer than 3-4 weeks to get that back on track, but I think you've mentioned this before, that can really mess people up, especially if they do it for a long period of time. And, it take people months and months to get past those sort of motor patterns that they've laid down over such a long period of time.
Especially if they don't have somebody that's educated enough to get them out of that pattern. Like that's one of the questions that we get asked a lot for people that have been doing like the lock it down scapular techniques or whatever. And they're like, well, how do I stop doing it? Because now it's almost become unconscious for them. Right. So they do it without even thinking about it. Like, and because we'll get people more like, are you trying to do that? And they're like, no, like that's now just the way they function. And that's where they're in the dangerous situation where that becomes like, that's now how their body functions. Like I have overridden proper joint mechanics instead to like move in this inefficient manner, like unconsciously in all things. And so I think that's definitely one of the biggest reasons to avoid that training. And, if you are coming out of that, if you are somebody, then learning what a full range of motion is for that joint is a great way. So like one of the best ways that we, get people out of that is actually just having them go through like these full protraction arcs, right? Okay. So you've not let your shoulder come on the anterior side of the body, like for, 2 years or whatever. So what we're going to do is we're purposely going to put you in exercises where the only way that you can complete them is to go into these positions that you like have been avoiding. And I think that's the fastest way to correct those. And sometimes you can get pretty quick corrections. But if a person doesn't have those exercises or that understanding, they can think because they consciously stop doing it, that they're no longer doing it, but those bad motor patterns can stay around for a long, long time unless they actively reverse them.
Yeah, definitely agree. How are you for time? Because I've got a bonus question that just kind of came to my mind. If you've got the time, I'd love to.
I'm good.
Sweet. The importance of matching nutrition to training. I know obviously something that nutrition is a huge part of what you do, and I know that when it comes to put together training programs, often nutrition is almost thought of as a bit of this is your nutrition part of your coaching, and this is the training part of your coaching. What would be your point of view as far as how important it is to match nutrition and training demands so that it's very symbiotic with the goal that you're trying to achieve?
So if you look at the research or you ask some people in the evidence-based community, they will say that it's not that significant based on what the research says. If you ask me what I think it's extremely important, especially because we're dealing with real world situations where there's compliance, there's the ability to sustain things, there's performance, there's all sorts of things that go along with that when we're outside of a controlled environment, especially when you're working with more trained individuals. Because it's kind of like that, like, well, okay, yeah, like if we're trying to gain or lose, is calorie or energy balance a better way of stating it? Is that probably the most important rock to tick? Well, yes. But then, okay, well, do macros matter if the energy balance is there? Like, well, yes, they matter, but they don't matter if you haven't checked off the first rock. So when it comes to matching, it's kind of that same thing of like, okay, matching the nutrition to the training is going to be important. But if we're glaringly missing, like if the training just simply isn't good, right? Or the nutrition just like, okay, like the calories are wear off or whatever. It's like it's high carb, but like it's the wrong amount of calories or whatnot. Like there's kind of like an order of importance or priority of things, right? And again, when we talk about adding these nuances, they tend to build on top of each other, meaning that if your training program has a few nuances that make it a little bit better, and then your nutrition program has a few nuances that make it a little bit better. Those two things amplify each other quite a bit, especially when we add the factor of time and the way they affect real people. Because if you take a person and you put them on a nutrition program that supports the performance of their training, they're likely to train better because they're going to feel better, right? They're likely to actually put more effort and execute the training program better, which means training stimulus from the output perspective should be better and more sustainable. Okay. They're also likely to be able to tolerate the actual diet itself better in terms of hunger, cravings, their sleep, like all of these things that, like, okay, if you look at a short period of time, may not make that much of a difference. But then when we look at, over weeks and months, these things can make a big difference because they're affecting compliance, they're affecting somebody's mood, they start to affect their physiology a little bit more. So those, when I look at how important this is, I'm like, well, if you're working with real human beings that have to make decisions on the daily, that care about how they feel, that care about how they look on the daily too, as well, because that's going to be a big factor too for some of these. Is like, for instance, if you go a super low carb approach and you put somebody on a certain program, they could get extremely flat in terms of their muscle tissue, which can give them the impression that they actually have not lost body fat, right? Or that they've lost so there's psychological things of man, not only is this affecting performance, but it could be affecting somebody's perception of what they think is happening, right? In terms of the results, because it's either changing the scale or changing visibly. And so these are all things to take into account, when you're going to start adding those nuanced layers. But the big thing for me is, if I'm going to invest the time and physiological stress into training, I want to make sure that I get the most out of that in the most efficient way possible, right? If I'm taking an hour of my day and I'm dedicating it to getting this stimulus, right? Why wouldn't I want to make sure that I get every drop of stimulus that I could? And then the same thing on the recovery side, okay? But I do have to balance that out with the individual and what maybe dietary limitations or psychological limitations they may have. And so I may need to adjust training to my constraints of nutrition, or vice versa, or it's finding that balance. So when we say match nutrition to training, that doesn't mean that nutrition is a slave to training. That means that you are finding the compromise to get the most out of them, because it may be that for one person, if I put them on this one training protocol, what would be the optimal nutrition for them doesn't fit the constraints between what they would actually comply to or enjoy or maybe digestively tolerate or whatever it may be in their nutrition program. So I have to figure out, okay, how can I create a training program that fits within the limitations of that nutrition program, right? So we're not doing sets or working at intensities that aren't benefiting us because we're limited by nutrition. So it's still that same mindset of, I'm trying to get the absolute maximum amount of stimulus that I can, but it's within the window of what's going to be effective. What can I recover from? What can I sustain? And so with us, we try and separate training stimulus pretty precisely. And that gives us the opportunity to use macronutrients and pre-workout and post-workout and stuff at a little bit more nuanced level than what you will often see, especially in people in the evidence-based community, where you're looking at okay, well, if we only did this one variable, because that's what you have to do in research, right? It's you have to constrain and only do one thing. It's well, was it a significant difference? And in most of those cases, well, I will agree that in the context of a lab controlled setting or whatever it may have been, I mean, they only did this vector, how much of a difference does it make? It's that's not much, but that's not at all how we use that. We do this stuff of layers and layers and layers of okay, I did this one thing so that I could do this other thing. And then I topped it off and then so now I have this kind of buildup of little things. And that absolutely, from our observations, makes a huge difference, not only in the results, but also just how a person actually feels as they go through that process. So that's one of the big things that's changed for me over the last, probably 5 years, was I think I'm able to get people results in a much more lifestyle, not adverse fashion, in in a way where it's like they don't have, like, I've decreased the suffering to get the same amount of results, I guess would be the best way, by really learning how to optimize both the training and the nutrition side together. It's like, man, we can create a lot of this physiology without as much disruption to a person's quality of life.
Yeah, that's like music to us. My wife is standing beside me just nodding her head, because we are very big on that as well. Like, if you look at, I think a lot of people don't talk about it, and I'm sure you've seen as well, the importance of the autonomic nervous system. Because say you've got these high net worth individuals or people that need high performance in their jobs, and you put them on a low carb diet and you try to get them to do 4 times, GBC 4 times a week, for example. And it's like, well, first of all, that's glycolytically demanding. Have they got enough to actually do that task? Secondly, have they got enough glycogen, even just in the brain, to actually utilize energy to perform at a highly cognitive level for their job, the thing they actually get paid for, to actually then pay you for the coaching in the first place? So yeah, it is so interesting when, and I liked what you said about the not being a slave to one or the other, but then it's kind of like, okay, well, then you bring in the autonomic nervous system, and then we're looking at stress, allostatic load, we're looking at digestion, and we start piecing together all of the little pieces to the puzzle. And I agree. I think, as much as I've studied a course called, you may have heard about, not MNU, Mac Nutrition, that Mark McDonald, and it was a great course, and it definitely gives you a great baseline to better interpret research and to kind of understand it a bit more. But I agree, there's just so much more nuance outside of just purely the evidence that is required, I find, like you say, to be able to deliver a service and a set of results without, I like the way you termed it, just like the same results for less suffering. I think that's always a win-win for everyone involved.
And a key component of that that's often overlooked, I think, is the amount of communication it takes for these, like, you can add all the nuances on the background that the client doesn't need to be aware of, but managing expectations, I think is another key success on the psychological component of that. Because like you brought up the example of like, okay, we're using this we're doing a low carb boot camp on like the GBC thing. And it's like, okay, what is the rationale there? Right. And I can tell you that a lot of people, like, their argument for that is like, well, we're going to see a massive scale drop, so psychologically we're going to get buy-in. Okay. And I don't necessarily think that that's 100% bad or good approach, depending on the psychology of the person that you're working with. Is like, well, does that maybe need to be a component that we somehow factor in there, right? Or do I take the approach where it's like, all right, I'm going to work with this person and I'm going to communicate expectation of like, hey, this first week or whatever, your weight might even go up, and I'm going to educate them on what's going on. And I think both of those are like, as long as you're doing things in an ethical way, I think there is times to sometimes say like, okay, I'm doing this thing purely from a psychological basis because I know it's going to pay off down the road because they either got that buy-in or I got their trust or whatever. But you have to be responsible with it. And that's where I think most people make the mistakes, is like, well, they do that and they haven't set that expectation. So the person expects to lose weight like that for the next, 12 weeks or whatever, right? Or instead of actually doing things to bring them back up to a more functional level, they just double down on that, or like, okay, we're going to drop the calories or add more or whatever, like, and the not doing the things that are needed to make this physiologically like a sustainable approach. So I think the communication with the client and just really managing expectations across the board, I think is one of the most powerful tools that you can have from a psychological standpoint. And for a lot of the coaches that we work with that are very technical based, I think that's the thing that they overlook. And then they struggle with the client interaction. And then I'll ask them like, well, okay, what does the client expect right now? Or what do they want right now? And they're like, well, I don't know. And I'm like, okay, so you're coaching them based off of what you want and what your expectation is, rather than on what they want and their expectation is, right? And I always give the example of, like, most trainers have had a client like for a long period of time. They get that one client that's just going to be with them for the rest of their life or whatever, right?
Yeah, never go.
Yeah, and those, and some trainers be like, oh yeah, I got this guy, I train him all the time, but like I don't like training him because he doesn't want to work hard or whatever. And I'm like, well, how often do you check in to see what they want to do right now? So, because I would have some of those and they would go through periods where like, I'm really ready to focus on things. And then they have other periods where it's like maintenance. Like, I'm coming in here to like like I'm in anti-fat mode right now. Like that my whole goal is like the whole reason I'm not really strict on my diet. I got a bunch of stress at work or whatever. Like I'm coming in here because, and I'm working with you because I don't want to think anymore. I want to be able to unplug my brain, and I'm just using this to like maintain. But then, 2 months later, like, okay, I'm taking this vacation or whatever it may be, and now I'm ready to hit it. And if you're not constantly like reevaluating what your expectations and your goals are with these people, like, then you could be programming or like looking at something that really doesn't matter, right? Like your expectations and the client's expectations always need to be aligned. And I think a lot of coaches end up putting more pressure on themselves than they need to for some of these long-term clients. Cause like, what, you thought they were going to lose like 1% body fat a week for infinity, right? Like they were just going to be a bag of bones. And you were just like what did you think was going to happen if you're going to train somebody for 5 years? You thought they were going to linearly progress like that whole time? Like, no, they're going to be just like every other human being. They're going to have ups and downs or whatever. And if you want to be able to be a positive influence in that person's life, like there's no reason that somebody could be like, yeah, I'm not tracking anything on my diet, but I still want to come in and get 3 good workouts a week. And that's just the way this next like month or 2 of my life is going to be. And as a coach, like, because that's this personal training and that's what you're asking for, you should be able to deliver that. You shouldn't be like, man, if you're not 100% dedicated, like I can't work with you. If you're not ready to do this and this and this, is like, well, wait a second. Like, are you a personal trainer? Or you're like, no, all I do is I get 2% body fat off people a week. That's what I do. Like, or do you actually help people achieve their goals? Right. And I think that's a very important distinction to make. And you have to manage expectations and communicate that regularly if you're actually going to help people meet their goals rather than trying to always get people to meet your goals. Right?
So happy you brought that up, because we're kind of both just like this, man. When we created our business, we looked at the traditional, right, well, the only thing that matters is that you get us before and after. And we didn't want to be any part of that. And we're like, okay, that's part of it. And we kind of set up almost like this, okay, there's these 5 building blocks that can be within any cycle of coaching, and each coaching cycle has a particular goal, but this is a journey. It's not here's your 8 or 12 weeks or 16 weeks, whatever it is, or a constant sprint, you're done. And we kind of built these ideas of like preparation phases, fat loss phases, reverse dieting phases, maintenance phases, and all these different, maybe even what we call solidification or optimized phases, which is like actually building, getting stronger, which is one I know you communicate with your female clients, we both do, about actually the importance of spending time having energy available to bloody lift and function and everything else. And it's so important because a lot of coaches get so pigeonholed into, for example, right, I'm a fat loss coach. Okay, but the fat loss is one part of a much bigger part of the journey. What about the maintenance part? And for us, we always tell our clients, like, and it's funny you say expectations. That's, I don't know how often we say that word in an initial consult, but one thing I tell clients is just like energy balance is a constant moving target, your expectations are a constant moving target as well. It's going to change, and it might be that you actually wanted this, but then 8 weeks in, you might have a bereavement or something might happen, that goal changes. And so you have to be flexible and pliable to things shifting and changing, even if you weren't expecting them to. So I think I love the fact that we finished the main part of the podcast on that, because it's hugely in line with how we try to do things.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that a lot of people focus on in that initial consult, and they just forget to keep checking in, on managing those expectations. One of the things that I always try to get people to do on their like their reassessment check-ins is actually, instead of just focusing on like, well, here's how much weight or whatever, is simply ask the person like, hey, like, how well am I managing like the expectations? How well am I delivering what you want right now? Right. And if great. If not, like, what is it that what is it more that you would want out of the service that I'm delivering? Because you may get a person that's like, you know what, I've been having this whatever problem, with my nutrition. Like, I would love to learn more. And like, that's the thing, that's the value that they happen to want at this period of time. Right. And I think managing expectations by asking what they want and then asking how well you're delivering on that on a regular basis is the best way to keep a client happy, like every single week, every single month, every single check-in. And also for you to be able to learn as a coach, because sometimes you'll, like, when you do this, a person may not tell you that their role has changed if they don't feel comfortable that they can communicate with your coach. Like, if you've been very like, we're going to get this and we're going to lose all this or whatever, they might be scared to tell you, like, man, dude, I just don't really give a shit right now. And so that's a part of that relationship, is you need to make sure that the client can be completely open with you about what they want. And so they really need to understand that you were there for what to serve them, right, towards their goals. Right now, there's and I will ask people this is like, okay, if you slough off a little bit, how do you want me to help you with that? Do you want me to crack the whip and get you in shape? Right. And, if that's the case, do we need to say like, okay, that's what I'll do. But also like, you need to be able to tell me like, okay, yeah, I know I told you to crack the whip, but I need you to tone it down for the next couple of weeks or whatever. Right. Like what role do you want me to be? Do you want me to be supportive? Do you want me to be like, okay, all right, we didn't get it this week. Do you want me to be like the positive handhold encouraging, or do you want to be like that's something that, I think as a trainer, that's a skill set that you can only grow with experience, but understanding what a client wants from you. And then also that helps you weed out, like when somebody asks for something that you just aren't comfortable or confident in delivering in, that helps you from like, okay, this isn't a good fit, rather than like 3 months down the road, person has a horrible experience and you both just ended up wasting a lot of time when somebody else could have been, really benefiting from you.
Definitely. So listen, I'm very conscious that we've already taken up a hell of a lot of your time, but it's been absolutely brilliant. I enjoyed it a ton. So what we usually do with these podcasts, we finish on what's called the quick fire round. So they're just completely non-serious, random questions. It's a great opportunity just for the people to get to know you a bit more as a person and not just as Coach Kassem, as you say, the educator, which is the last thing people knew you for. So we'll dive into some of the little fun stuff. So question number one, favorite exercise currently?
It's actually squats, but that's biased because I have a new toy to squat with, right? And so anytime I have something new to play around with, so that's what it is it squats with the new prototype squat bar that we're doing. Especially because I haven't, like, if you follow us, that, we're not like, oh, everybody's got to squat. Like there's a lot of better exercises, but now it's like, oh, now I can squat better than a squat. Okay, cool. Let's see what this thing can do.
Yeah, for those that haven't seen the bar that Kassem is working on with Prime Fitness, it's worth taking a little bit of a look at. I don't think you can see it anywhere on the website or anything like that, but if you just check out your feed at the moment, there's been some little bits and bobs on there, I think.
Yeah, I think it should start going up on the website later this week.
Nice. What was it? What's the retail on that?
I don't know, right? And for anybody listening, I do not work for Prime, so don't ask me like I get a lot of these questions or whatever, but it's one of those things where I want better tools for myself. I want better tools for the coaches out there and whatnot. And that's kind of why I dedicate my ideas, I guess, or whatnot, to that. And I enjoy it, right? Like I come from a background of like, doing construction work and stuff like that. So I visually see things better than I communicate. I don't actually verbally articulate near as well as what I can like visualize in my mind. So I really enjoy the problem solving of like, man, how could we make this thing better? It's like, it's been around like for 50 years. Nobody's thought of to change it, but it's like, but if we just did this little thing, and then all of a sudden, then we have a new thing. Right?
I tell you what, I think a lot of people are definitely going to benefit from that, especially when the traditional setup doesn't maybe suit them specifically. So I'm excited to try one if it ever makes its way to the Middle East, to Dubai. What's your least favorite exercise?
The least favorite, like in the world, or the least favorite one that I do personally?
Both. Let's do that.
Both. Right. Well, I would say least favorite in the world would probably be something like the frog pump, because it literally does the opposite of what it's claimed to do. And for me personally, least favorite is probably, I would say, like lying leg curls. And if anybody that's followed me might know that I'm missing a semimembranosus in my left leg. And so and to this day, I still haven't decided whether I'm better off trying to balance out that strength or let them be separate, or I have a tremendous ability for figuring out what would be optimal in somebody that has all of the muscles in their body. But as soon as you start removing ones and we start changing the underlying structure, like how much do I actually train the compensatory muscle patterns versus actually focusing on improving the tissue that's there? And so that's the thing, I go back and forth, and that's kind of my struggle. Is it now? I love that as an exercise, but for me personally, that's one of the ones where it's like, I go back and forth on whether or not, like, okay, I'm only going to do this unilateral, or I'm going to really emphasize this, or I'm going to de-emphasize this, because that's just going to make more of a structural imbalance. Like, yeah, that's a mental gymnastics for me on what the hell to do with.
So that's the problem. With great knowledge comes great responsibility, and unfortunately, when it applies to itself, it can become a bit of a like mental.
Yeah. So this is
exactly the way to describe it.
Yep.
Definitely cool. So, what's an interesting fact that most people won't know about you?
Well, I'm pretty open on my social media. I think the authenticity thing has really started to come out. So there's not a lot of secrets left. But I would say one thing that people don't really know that much about me. Man, that's going to be tough. I guess what I would actually say is, because a lot of people like will see me and be like, oh man, he's so smart or whatever. And actually, with all of this stuff, I'm extremely critical of myself. And I think a lot of people struggle with that in this industry and think they're alone. They think the people at the top, maybe they don't struggle with that thing. They're like, oh man, this person, they're successful or whatever, they probably don't see that obstacle where it's like me. It's like, no, like I'm super like hypercritical of everything that we do, right? I just bought a lab so that we can double check everything that we're doing, all the information that we're putting out. And I could have bought like a sports car or something instead. But instead, I bought a bunch of lab equipment so that I can feel a little bit more comfortable about the information that we're putting out.
That is buying. I just bought a lab just to make sure that I'm kind of doing things the right way. That's dedication to a craft, though. That's for sure. So, from that note, if you're obviously someone who has been or can potentially be quite critical of yourself, who would you say are some of the people that have shaped your career the most?
It's there's a lot of people, and it's kind of come in waves, right? So. Like in the very beginning of my career, like Paul Chek was one of the guys that really like motivated me to look more in depth at nutrition, and Charles Poliquin was one of the guys that like really got me into looking more at a principle-based training methodology, right? I did all of his stuff, and a lot of the things I've learned in terms of communicating with coaches and stuff also comes from some of the things that Charles did both successfully and unsuccessfully, right? But like if you look at my current thought process and methodology, it doesn't really follow any of the things that they've done, but I learned from how they did things more so than what they did, and that's kind of been kind of the same way, throughout the course of my career, is that most of the people that have mentored me, we've kind of, from a technical perspective, we don't really do things like anybody else, but I've had a ton of mentors that have kind of helped me get to where I am in terms of like how they taught, both from a good and a bad perspective. Right. And so, more recently, like Tom Purvis's RTS was what got me interested in, digging even deeper into biomechanics and physics. But I don't do things the way that, I mean, I don't say that like physics is still physics, but but our approach and the way we teach it, and the way we utilize those things is much different, right? So it's so again, it's kind of follows that that same pattern of like, man, a lot of times what you learn from somebody is not the system, and I think that's actually the best thing. If you're like if you're doing a mentor justice, and I was having this conversation with somebody else that was another Poliquin coach, and we're talking about like the whole direction that whole group of people is going or whatnot, and how there was this big like battle of like, oh, how are we going to carry on the legacy? And a lot of people will regurgitate the stuff their mentors do, and that's not paying homage to their legacy. If you want to do honor to your mentors, you take what they taught you, and then you build on it. You pay it forward and you move it forward. I think that's the one consistent thing across the majority of the positive influences, like like Bob Rakowski and Charles Poliquin probably being the top two, is just the mindset that they took about their careers and about their businesses and about the impact that they wanted to have on the industry as a whole, right? And I think that's probably the thing that's been the most encouraging for me, is to be able to find a few people that really want to make a difference rather than make a dollar. Because that's what I'm always trying to justify to people that critique the way I run my business. Is usually the critiques are never technical. They're always, you could be making so much more money if you did X, Y, or Z. and then I have to defend my position of like, but that doesn't actually meet the goal that I want to accomplish, right? Which is, I want to have a bigger impact. And I want the coaches that are coming in now to be able to have better education and a better path than what I had, right? I'm not complaining about mine. I'm just saying, man, I could have got to this point so much faster, had there been some different resources.
You have your own N=1 outcomes that you want from your career. So why should anyone else try to enforce their, well, you should make more money. I don't know if I would say it doesn't buy you any happiness, but it's not the answer to everything, is it? So it just allows you to buy labs and fun stuff like that. So that's always good. If you were stuck on a desert island and could only take 3 items, what would they be?
And I suppose a spaceship and a time machine or something like that are not applicable, right? If we're really thinking critically about this stuff.
Haven't decided if we can border the realms of reality with this question. Let's say
right.
Reality, so.
Yeah. Honestly, I mean, first thing would be my dog, for sure. Like if that, like, there you go. Like, that's got to be that right there, right? Definitely got to have my dog, and then a lot of pizza somehow, like a just gigantic box of pizza, and last thing. Well, if I'm going to have to survive, right, in that case, probably something to collect water, right? I don't know, maybe I'm getting too practical there, right? So water, pizza, and my dog.
Pizza, and what I was thinking, pizza is so hyper palatable, you won't have to ration your food, right? That's the chances of you rationing a really delicious pizza.
Well, if you just follow the people that do the thermodynamics, I could eat all of the pizza and then I would just have it as a reserve for later, right? Isn't that how that works?
Oh dear, there's a rabbit hole.
Instant gratification versus long-term gratification. Like I don't know. To be honest, like, I mean, I think different people go, this is one of those N of 1 things. So last tangent there, like for me, like I actually do better off with larger meals than a lot of smaller meals. So if I eat something that's very calorie dense, it satiates me for longer and I actually end up eating less calories during the day. Now, I'm not saying that like, pizza is a good diet food, but I'm saying that for one person, like a hyper palatable foods may be very bad for what they're trying to achieve. And for another person, it might be like, this actually helps you. Like if I'm doing a chicken diet, like that would be one thing that would not be on there, would be chicken. Yeah, like I would starve to death on an endless supply of chicken on the island. We'll put it that way. Because it's like I could eat a little bit and then my body's just like, yeah, like no more. Like this, no more. Like it just crushes my appetite. So it's like, man, for every person's approach, it's like, find that thing that gives you the best net outcome, right? So pizza, water, dogs.
Pizza, water, dogs. It's not a bad list in fairness. It's definitely a better list than some of the other lists we've had. Some of the other lists has been like, I'll take my phone. I was like, okay. And then we didn't take a charger. I was like, so what happens when it dies? Like, come on, man. Yeah. And do you really want your phone on a desert island? Really?
Yeah.
No network signal. No. Anyway, it is what it is.
Can still take selfies, right?
For the gram, obviously. What's your happiest or proudest moment as a coach?
Oh geez. I think the very first camp we did here in Colorado, where essentially I had taken a lot of people from a very bad situation in Tampa And then we did our first event here in Colorado, and seeing the change in their demeanor, the smiles on their faces, and then all of the new people that were just so excited that like this N1 thing had started. That was one of the best weekends of my life, right? You know, is just actually, actually seeing so many people positively impacted, especially coming from a really poor situation. And it's like at that point, I knew like it's all going to work out.
Awesome. I think that's can't top that, I don't think. Who's the one person you'd like to interview or meet in person that you haven't yet? Doesn't have to be industry specific.
Well, I mean, most of the things that I'm interested in are in this industry. One of the minds that just fascinates me, one of the guys that I think like just really gets some of the stuff currently, would be Henning Weckerage, who's like pioneering the research on basically all of the mechanisms of mechanotransduction and stuff like that. He's a Swedish guy, and like when he speaks things, I have to stop and rewatch them like over and over and over again. And he's been a huge inspiration for what we look at mechanistically. One, I just find like Northern European, like Swedish, like, you know, like going to Finland or something would be awesome in general, I think. But you know, that guy there. If we're talking alive or dead, Richard Feynman, because in terms of the way that I think and the way I conceptualize things, they call it like pattern assimilation, where you're essentially very good at like taking like information from all sorts of different things and kind of putting it together and all of a sudden creating new knowledge out of pre-existing information. That's kind of what I see as like that's my skill set or my gift. And Richard Feynman's probably the greatest one of those in our time. So man, I would love to be able to sit down and talk with him about how he thinks about things and probably optimize my potential a ton.
I've not heard of either of those people, although my wife is Swedish, so she gave a big thumbs up for the Swedish guy. I can confirm it's a beautiful country. Definitely need to visit at some point, for sure. What's your favorite non-industry specific book? Because I'm sure, like you say, you probably read a lot of stuff from the industry, but I'm sure there's some stuff outside the industry that has been, that's resonated hugely.
The Compassionate Samurai has always been one that has yet to be topped for me, just in terms of one, I read it at a point in my life where it really impacted me, but like it's a principle based thing. I mean, basically, you want to summarize the book, it's like how to be successful while being a good person is essentially that's what it is, right? It's just like, okay, you know, how to get ahead without stepping on other people is kind of the gist of it, and going through the honor code, you know, the Bushido, and how that applies to our modern world. So that's probably that would be my favorite.
I have to add that to the reading list for sure. Sounds like a good one. We're getting into the final three questions. So this one is always an interesting one. What is the meaning of life?
Well, biologically, they would say to procreate, but that's something I'm not interested in, especially I think after, like, now that we're in 2020, I think that's going to be a really hard case for anybody to argue with me that that's a good idea right now. You know, people do what you want to do, right? But like, so I would say for me personally, you know, since that's off the table, it's leaving the world a better place than I came in.
That's a good one. Always like that one. That's always a good one. So not procreation, just leaving things in a better situation.
Yeah.
Very good
right.
Point. Who should we have next on the podcast?
You know, honestly, I didn't do a lot of due diligence just to look at like the whole host of guests you've had. Like there's some people who I really like their perspective and the way they're attacking things on the industry right now are Ben House and Evan Pycon, that are both kind of like, I mean, if you want to talk about some nerdy stuff, I think that they're both going there, but also can relate it, and they really understand, like, you know, the guy in the trenches. You know, I think you can't go wrong with either of those two.
Yeah, I like Ben a lot. He's it's funny. I was just listening to his Revive Stronger podcast that he just did, and yeah, you think like for how he comes across on social, and he's very, like you said, very very knowledgeable. He just speaks so like just like a regular dude, so casual.
Mm-hmm.
I think he does a very good job of communicating information in a super easy way. He does a lot of functional medicine stuff as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's been around in his career, everything from from pre-med to functional medicine. I mean, his doctorate is in nutritional sciences. If you ask him, it's like he cares about basically getting more bigger. That's so. He's educated himself on all of the things about getting more bigger.
Very articulate way to put it as well. So lastly, thanks for coming on. It's been fantastic for you to be on. It's been a pleasure for me just recording this. And I'm sure as we get this out to more people listening to it, I'm sure this will probably be one of our most popular episodes as well. And I'm sure even like as we go months and years down the line, as this podcast actually gains a bit more traction and grows, people will probably come back to this episode to rewatch it. Where's the best place for people to connect with you currently?
So Instagram is the best place to kind of see what I'm doing. So it's coach_Kassem. But we have two brand accounts as well, n1.education, n1.training. And if you want to follow more just like the actual information, those accounts are intuitively named. The education platform is geared a little bit more towards talking to coaches and trainers, whereas the training one is more for like, hey, here's like very simple, easy to digest information on those. Our websites are the respective. We have if you want to see kind of what we do, how we teach, we have trial versions of both of our things. So if you just go in my bio on education, it's got everything. It's got the other accounts, it's got our trials, and, links to our other podcast appearances on YouTube, et cetera, and stuff like that. And then if you really, really, really want to get to know me, come to a practical. If, fingers crossed, we get to the point where we can start doing live events again. I tell lots of dad jokes from what I hear.
I like dad jokes. When are you coming to Dubai? That's the next question.
Well, when am I going anywhere is the question that needs to be answered before that, right? But yeah, so I don't know. Like right now, I'm just completely up in the air on our travel plans. I don't foresee us leaving the country in 2020, except maybe Canada if that opens up. And then we have a lot of people in the UK. But it's possible that when all of a sudden the world opens up, that I just do like a big 6-week long tour. And I go like Ireland, UK, Netherlands. We've even talked about maybe doing something in Italy and Croatia, and then go south down to Dubai, then come home, rest a little bit, and then do the same thing in New Zealand, Australia, and Hong Kong. So, but when? I'm so done trying to predict things during this period. I've just like, you know what? I don't look past really tomorrow or the week. At this point in time, because things can change so fast.
Yeah, definitely. I think we just see what happens over the rest of the year, and then we can just touch base when the world seems to open up a bit. We can I can give you just a gentle nudge, a reminder. Hey, don't forget to buy.
Yeah, because I mean, who knows? Maybe I'll have to show up in like a full body hazmat suit, and that'll be the future. I saw a thing the other day about how they're thinking like, oh, maybe people are gonna have to wear goggles and face shields now, and I'm like, oh, like we're supposed to be going the other direction.
Yeah. Well, it's just fingers crossed it doesn't go there. So listen, Cass, thanks again very much for coming on. For everything that you mentioned, I'll link in our show notes in terms of the links to the social media, the website. For everyone else listening, the best way that you can support us as a podcast is to go onto your preferred podcast platform. If you're on Apple Podcasts, leave us a 5-star review. That would be absolutely fantastic. Check us out on social media as well at Better Body Collective. And once again, Kassem, thanks for coming on.
You're welcome, man. It was great to be on. It's a good conversation.